G'day from sunny Brisbane, the home of the Australian Access Federation. Now, I know the title of the presentation is a little clickbaity. I'd like to start by acknowledging our technical team, particularly Chris and Ryan and Russell, for all the hard work they've done in finding and resolving a number of complex technical challenges. I'd also like to thank Dahlia and Terry from our support team, who have identified a lot of edge cases and helped to shepherd our customers through the migration process to get onto the platform. So why build a cloud identity provider platform? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First up, we got a lot of requests from customers to build one. And it turns out moving shibboleth to the cloud is a pretty good candidate for a cloud system. There's a lot of complexity involved in the first deployment of the identity provider. People have to get their heads around how the software works, and it becomes a fairly involved project. Upgrades are becoming more and more frequent, and sometimes an upgrade is almost as much work as a new deployment. So that adds to the complexity. We found a lot of small organisations were unable to join the AAF because it's too hard for them to run their own infrastructure, and they don't have the IT staff to deploy systems. So that excluded them from participation in some cases. The second reason is identity teams are under unrelenting demand. So they're at the heart of all sorts of projects that are going on in the organisation, and this was true even before COVID. They've got too much to do and there's not enough people to do it. Maintaining the infrastructure is by no means a core capability for universities, so it's a good opportunity for someone else who spends more time in that situation to be able to pick up and run with the system. And once the system is up and running, I mean, it can generally run for quite a long period of time without any intervention. And unfortunately, that can lead to neglect. And it's not deliberate. People feel like they've got the ability to take on maintenance and updates. But the problem is, once the fire hose of reality starts spraying them in the face, maintaining and patching the shibboleth IDP quickly slides down the priority list. An unmaintained infrastructure is a security risk not only to that organisation, but to all participants in the Federation. So I know we're not unique in Australia. I think everyone else has seen these sort of situations in your own Federation and can probably relate to them as well. In terms of expected benefits, there is a number that we were aiming for. So we were hoping to lower entry barriers for smaller organisations, and I think we've certainly been able to do that. We've had organisations join quickly and be able to come onto the Federation using the cloud infrastructure. Faster deployment was another objective of ours. So before we had Rapid IDP, the fastest new customer to join the Federation took something like 45 days from the first time we spoke with them to when they had their system up and running in production. That was the fastest. Now with Rapid IDP, we've deployed one inside 3 days. So we spoke to someone on Monday, Wednesday afternoon, their service was up and running. Improved reliability is another benefit. So we had 100% uptime last year. The only issues we've ever really had in production have been problems with LDAP systems inside university campuses. Improved security is another benefit, so we're able to deploy patches really quickly. Critical vulnerabilities are generally patched within 24 hours, and there's a regular patching and maintenance cycle, so we're constantly putting out updates through the full infrastructure stack. And the final benefit there we're after is improved visibility of activity within the Federation. So we're trying to get some reporting on what services are being used and who's using them. So we've made some progress towards that, but we're not all the way there yet. We've got lots of data getting collected, but we still need to expose that through some sort of dashboard. So like most projects, we start out with we think it'll be an uphill journey, but generally a pretty smooth ride. The truth is always that it looks much more like an Indiana Jones movie. So let's have a look at the journey so far. We started out in 2016 with some money that was left over from another government-funded project. And with this, we employed 2.5 developers and 1 project manager, and that enabled us to lay the foundations for a cloud platform. It was still a long way from being a saleable and usable platform at that stage, but we had the foundations in place. The other thing we did that year was to run something along the lines of a Kickstarter style program. We called it an early adopter program, where we got universities to contribute funding to carry on development for the next year. So this was in some sense a validation of the market for the product. So 7 universities contributed $360,000, and that was enough to pay for 2 developers and a project manager for the rest of the year. And at the end of 2017, we had a minimum viable product. So it was usable, but there was lots of manual processes, and it certainly wasn't pretty at that stage. 2018 we launched and we acquired 3 customers throughout the year, which was by no means enough to pay for the costs of running the service through that year, the 2 developers and the project manager and all the infrastructure. And things were starting to look a little bit dire here. It wasn't taking off in the way we expected it to. The board was starting to ask some questions about, well, why aren't people buying it? And one of the things we did here is to go back and get some more funding through some funding agencies. We got enough money to run for 2 more years, but this was kind of a do or die last throw of the dice. So in 2019, we had another $450,000 to play with. With that, we had 3 developers, 50% project manager or product manager, and 1 business development person. The focus was to deliver automation and also to migrate the virtual home, our identity provider of last resort, onto the Rapid IDP platform. We had 6 customers plus the virtual home at the end of the year, so things are improving, but we're still a long way short of having a sustainable product. 2020 was the last round of external funding and the last opportunity to get the service to the point of sustainability. So again, we had 2 developers, half a project manager and a business development person. The focus here was integration with other cloud identity solutions like Okta and Azure AD, and that was a substantial effort, but we got there in the end. By the end of that year, we had 19 production customers, plus the virtual home, so a big uptake, and I'll talk to some of the reasons for that shortly. That took us to 2021. We're now in a position where we have a sustainable service. It earns enough money to pay for the 2 developers and the 50% product manager role. The focus this year is around refinement, so we're polishing the rough edges, doing more automation. We currently have 20 customers on the platform, but there's at least another dozen in the pipeline at various stages of migration. So to summarise it in, I guess, 2 slides, $2 million worth of investment and something north of 19 person years of effort. We've had some other involvement from our comms team and various other people, so it's probably more than the 19 years, it's probably more like 20 or more. Geoffrey Moore's technology adoption curve certainly came into play in the delivery of this product. So each segment looks at the groups before them for signals to adopt a product. So we had a couple of innovators that picked it up quickly, and we had a couple of early adopters. And then we ran into the chasm. So there's this large gap between the early market and the main market. And we kind of languished here for about 3 years with Rapid Identity Provider. The problem with that is you're spending cash developing a product, but you're not getting enough revenue to keep the thing going. And this is where a lot of technology products and a lot of companies end up dying. So that's called the valley of death for that reason. Thankfully, we're past that now, and we're kind of in positive cash flow area. And I can tell you it's a much less stressful place to be. The turning point came in the second half of last year, and there are 4 reasons I think that contributed to that. Firstly was investment in a business development role in 2019. So this became someone's job and not just a hobby. So I was doing a little bit, other people in AF were doing a little bit of business development, but it certainly wasn't the focus of our role. Having someone full-time in that role, it still took a year or so before the seeds started to grow, but had we not done that, I don't think we'd be in the position we're in today. COVID-19 had a significant impact on the Australian university sector. The estimates of 17,000 jobs, or 10% of the workforce, being lost through redundancy through that process. And that meant a lot of key personnel disappeared out of the identity space and the IT space generally, and that helped to accelerate the adoption of as-a-service models by our customers. Shibboleth 4 came along, and that was a significant project to upgrade, and customers did not have the capability to do it because of the losses of jobs mentioned in the previous point. So we're offering Shibboleth 4 upgrades as part of the onboarding to Rapid Identity Provider, and that's proved to be quite a useful selling point. And finally, by integrating with Okta, Azure AD and other cloud enterprise identity systems, we were able to offer that to customers, and they've jumped on that, and I think just about every new customer that's come on board has elected to integrate using that pattern. That enables them to use multi-factor authentication and to have a single login whether they're accessing a on-campus system or a federated system. So let's have a quick look at the product itself. Some of the key features: there's 3 deployment modes, so we can connect to an LDAP directory on the customer's campus. It can operate in what we call virtual mode, so a local database of users with an interface to add new users, and that's good for these small research organisations that probably don't have another identity system. It's okay for 6 up to maybe up to about 50 users. Gets a bit unmanageable after that. And then we have integration with the enterprise systems for the large organisations. It's designed for high availability, so all the infrastructure is treated as cattle, not pets. If anything goes wrong, we just destroy that instance and build a new one in its place. There's a number of smart checks that are put in to ensure that any suspect configuration doesn't make it out. So once a new image is built, we do a range of checks before we actually deploy that to production. So that prevents any questionable config actually getting out and potentially causing an outage. It auto-scales, it's spread across multiple availability zones within AWS. Security is baked in from the start, so we've chosen to deploy customer instances on separate virtual machines. It's certainly not the most cost-effective way for us, but it does help to ensure security for customers. We're leveraging a range of AWS capabilities to increase security, and we also do regular third-party penetration testing to look for any potential vulnerabilities. Onboarding, offboarding, updates are all zero downtime, so we can deliver updates without any downtime to the system. We build new servers, put them into the load balancing pool, swap the old ones out. And there's an attractive web content advisory group, compliant, accessible user interface, and that can be built in under 5 minutes. In terms of the platform architecture, the 3 modes I mentioned, so we've got a LDAP mode that connects back to an LDAP directory on the campus of the university. That's all done through secure connections. We can host the identities on the platform itself in a local database for small organisations, or connect through to cloud identity providers. So far we've integrated with F5, Azure and Okta, but as long as it's a SAML compliant provider, we should be able to integrate with just about anything. The architecture for each instance is all heavily working on AWS. We use a range of AWS security mechanisms up front to try and ensure that only legitimate traffic gets through to the service. Goes through a load balancer to a virtual private cloud, and here we have multiple servers spread across several availability zones in an auto-scaling group. So it automatically responds to load and will add infrastructure if needed. The images themselves are built using the Amazon machine image technology. So we have a base image that we use for all of our identity providers. We then overlay customer configuration to build an image specifically for that customer, and then that gets deployed to create instances for them. Here's a shot of the attribute resolution screen. So we can do static attributes, we can pull an LDAP, an attribute out of the directory, we can do scripted attributes, and this helps to abstract the configuration from the direct Shibboleth files. And this greatly simplifies the upgrade process and made moving to Shibboleth 4 a relatively straightforward process for us. It's certainly come a long way from the original interface where it was just type in raw XML, so we certainly do not want to go back to that again. Here's a shot of the LDAP test configuration. So we're able to do a bind to the directory and test that everything's working before we actually do a deployment. So this has been really helpful in some of the earlier deployments in ensuring that there's a good chance that the thing's going to work before we deploy it. If it's broken and we can't connect to the LDAP directory, there's no point doing a deployment at this time. Here's a shot of the deployment screen. So each deployment is snapshotted and we can roll back to any deployment if anything goes wrong for any reason. There's a column there about the test principle, so we can nominate one or more accounts from the directory, and it will actually check the attributes on the existing snapshot, build a new one, and then check the attributes again and make sure there's been no changes. And again, if there is, it'll pause the rollout and we can make sure that everything's working properly before we deploy it. And here's a shot of the branding screen. So this, we just get in and create the branding, and here's a preview before it actually gets deployed. There have certainly been a number of challenges along the way. So the first of them is the pricing model. We've made several iterations on pricing, but the challenge is when you've got, a small research organisation with 6 users at one end of the spectrum. On the other end, you've got a university with 10,000 staff and 50,000 students. Trying to find a nice sliding scale that spits out an appropriate number in terms of price across that is quite complex. So we've tweaked the model, we've changed it as we've gone through, but I don't think we're at the end of that yet. We compete with ourselves. So as well as offering Rapid IDP, we also have a Rapid IDP or an IDP installer. So it runs Docker images and people can kind of install and run their own IDP. We have professional services where they can pay us to upgrade the identity provider for them. And both of those are often more economical options for the customer, although perhaps not in the long run. The other challenge is that universities have already done the hard work. The magic's kind of gone. They've set up their IDP, and it's in some ways easier for them just to roll on with the current way of doing things. Migration has been challenging and a lengthy process. I think I mentioned that one customer is still nearly 12 months into the process and we still don't have a test environment up and running for them. And that's because of years and years of poor practice, limited expertise at the other end, so that they don't quite understand how to do things because people have gone, and a decade of accumulation of craft. So you often have a range of people stepping through and working on the identity provider over the years. They don't always understand what's gone on before, so they just carry the config forward and this accumulates, and now we're having to unpick a decade's worth of changes. And also security assessments by customers are time consuming, so I've got multiple spreadsheets of between 100 and 160 questions usually that we need to fill in to satisfy their security and compliance people. I guess that's par for the course, but it's something new for us and it's a fairly time-consuming activity. In terms of lessons through this process, so first of all, it's not all rainbows and unicorns, so even despite people asking for it, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to pay for a service. So we thought we did a pretty reasonable job of validating the market, but uptake was very slow, and without that business development role, I don't think we would have got to the point where we are now. Timing is everything with some of these releases. So unfortunately, we first launched right after we'd had a concerted campaign to get everyone upgraded from Shibboleth version 2 to version 3. And that meant they wanted to get some value out of their project investment. So in a lot of cases, it was going to be another 2 or 3 years before they were in a position to think about a new strategy. We certainly learned from that, and we made some different tactics and approaches around announcing the upgrade to Shibboleth 4. And in fact, before we announced that, we upgraded everyone who was on the Rapid IDP platform to Shibboleth 4 before we even told people that they needed to start thinking about that project. Hosted solutions have more appeal to new customers. So the universities kind of understand what's already required, and they to some extent dismiss the amount of work that's involved there. New customers, it's all still a bit mysterious, and to be able to say we can get them on board within a couple of days is quite a compelling proposition. When we started building Rapid IDP, we had no concept of it ever being used outside of Australia, and we kind of baked in some assumptions about how the configuration would work. We've had a lot of questions and interest and requests from international federations, and we're gradually extracting that hard-baked configuration and putting it into tables and config files. So it's still a way off, but we're hopeful in another year or two we may be able to offer this as a service to other federations as well. So what's next? Well, first of all, we've got a long customer migration backlog that we need to clear. There's probably at least 12 organisations that we need to work through. We also have some tools that we want to build to help switch people from the LDAP deployment mode onto proxy mode, so they can use Azure or Okta or one of the other cloud providers. We'd like to be able to actually turn off LDAP in the longer term. It might take a little while, but most of the customers that are currently using that have already expressed interest to switch across to the more modern way of doing things. And finally, we need to get a reporting dashboard going. So whilst we're collecting good data, we have no way of seeing what's going on without a fairly painful process. And we need to expose that to customers to help demonstrate the value, because it's all very hidden and invisible at the moment. That's all I have time for today. I hope you found something useful in that presentation that you can take away. Let's take some questions.